Are you ready for a scare? It's time for the jump scare precon that involves the blue-green color combination from Duskmourn. Now, this is one of my favorite decks of these precons because it has a mechanic that hasn't been seen in a long time, with Manifest getting a little bit of a scary twist to give us the jump scare mechanic here. So let's take a look at this deck and see what it can do and what we're going to do to make it a little bit more thematic and a little bit stronger. The jump scare precon is led by Duskmourn Mystery Unraveler for 2, a blue and a green. It's a 3/3 human wizard with landfall. The landfall is Manifest Dread if it's the first time it resolves this turn. Otherwise, you can flip a face down permanent you control face up. So it finally looks like we have a precon that is strong enough to support a face down mechanic. They really tried with the Naya Disguise deck for Karlov Manor, but it just came up short since they didn't really make enough cards that cloaked creatures to keep the disguised creatures coming. This precon, however, and the main set for Duskmourn seem to have a ton of cards that focus on the main mechanic of this deck, which is Manifest Dread. If you missed on what that actually does, Manifest Dread has you look at the top 2 cards of your deck, you pick one, you put it face down as a 2/2 creature on the battlefield, and the other one goes to your graveyard. The other one that you put onto the battlefield can then be flipped face up if it's a creature on the face down side by paying its casting cost. However, Duskmourn here can actually cheat around that by letting any land drops, ramp cards, and the things like that net you a second landfall trigger, flipping over any of your face down creatures without paying those mana costs. And that applies to any face down creatures that you may be using, including the original Morph creatures, Megamorphs, manifested creatures that you might have gotten using the Tarkir stuff, or any disguised creatures alongside what you've gotten via Manifest Dread. And on top of that, Duskmourn's trigger says face down permanent, not just creature. So if you ended up with an artifact, an enchantment, a planeswalker, a battle, anything like that, off of a Manifest Dread, you can still flip them over into their original form, something you couldn't do by paying the mana cost of the permanent unless it was already a creature. All right, let's get into the upgrades. First things first for this deck, we're going to need to dip into the main set and put several cards that support Manifest Dread in the deck that they did not include in the precon. So let's start off by cutting out Rashmi, Eternity's Crafter. It's a fun card, but doesn't really do what I want in this deck. However, the Abhorrent Oculus from the main set does. Rashmi gets us a free card off of our first spell each turn, but it requires us to keep casting spells, whereas the Oculus gives us the Manifest Dread that we want during each of our opponent's upkeeps. No need to have extra spells to cast, and it just fits the theme of the deck that much better. So that's what we're going to run. Next up, and this one hurts me because I love clone spells, we're going to be cutting Cackling Counterpart. It just doesn't do enough of what I want for this deck, and as a one-off clone, it's just not what I want in the deck. So instead, I'm going to be pulling in Hauntwood Shrieker from the main set to help Duskmourn in flipping over our creatures and adding to the critical mass of Manifest Dread cards in the deck. With our next edition, I can't understand why it just wasn't in the precon to begin with, so we're going to fix that mistake by keeping in a spell that gets us lands, but taking one out that did the same thing. Greater Shinuki is an alright card, but you're mostly wanting it for the land ramp versus just being a big body in the deck, so it's going to get pushed aside for threats around every corner. This card puts in a lot of work in the deck. It has a Manifest Dread trigger that when it enters and whenever something else comes into face down, so we get to go ahead and get a basic land out of our deck, put it into play tapped, and it more than pays for itself once you get multiple lands off of it and provides more value as the game carries on. And I love it in this deck too, because if you've already played a land for the turn and you bring this down, as soon as you start manifesting Dread over and over again, it's going to make it easier to get that second landfall trigger off of Duskmourn to flip things over. Then we have another straight swap. Counterspell is a fine card all in all, but there is a completely on-theme counter in the main set with Twist Reality that gives us options, so you can either counter something with it, just like a cancel, or we can have an instant speed Manifest Dread effect, allowing us to sneak a face-down creature past removal and then flip it on the next turn to attack. And then the next card I'm going to remove is Aether Gale. This is a blue version of Hex, and like Hex, it has the exact same issue. You must have 6 targets to even cast this. So if the board is light or your opponent has things you just really don't want to bounce because you don't want to give them more ETB triggers or whatever, it could just end up stranded in your hand. So instead, I'm going to hit the main set for Valgavoth's Onslaught. This is the marquee Manifest Dread spell of the set. However much you can dump into that X, you're going to manifest that many creatures on the board and put that many counters on them. And with a creature like the Sentinel Hierophant, which comes with the precon, you should be able to drop quite a bit into that X. Moving on to another change, and this one is not a one-for-one swap. It's Karu's Spell Snatcher coming out of the deck. It's a nice flip card, but you're going to have to pay for it the old-fashioned way to get its flip effect since it's a counterspelling effect, and very rarely can you get a landfall trigger at instant speed, let alone 2 of them on a consistent basis to get Zimone to trigger it and flip it for free. So that means holding up 6 mana to use this to counter something. Yeah, no thanks. So instead, we're going to get a new card in the form of Paranormal Analyst into the deck. This is good since we're going full tilt on the Manifest Dread effects in the deck. This thing's going to put in some extra work for us. You manifest Dread, and then normally you have to be fine with losing one of the 2 cards during the ability's resolution, but with the Analyst down, instead you get one of them face down, and then you get to pitch it into the graveyard, and then this will trigger, allowing you to bring it back to your hand. Just all in all, it's a great card for this deck. Now that we've gotten all the new stuff into the deck I want to add, and we're also going to want to have additional ways of playing several lands per turn, or at least ramping out additional lands to get things flipping. One change is to actually get Beanstalk Giant out of the deck. For 3 mana, I want more out of my land ramping spells, which is why I'm swapping in Harrow. The Giant can only get us 1 trigger off of Zimone, where the Harrow can actually get 2 right away and at instant speed. So you could use it at the end of an opponent's turn, manifest Dread a creature down, and flip it right away and have access to whatever it is right away. I'm also not a fan of Retreat to Coral Helm. It's a landfall trigger, but it's not a particularly good one for its cost. The Scry is really all we care about off of this thing. And, you know, I can see that where it's good for stacking up the top of the deck for what you want to manifest, but it's not really a compelling reason to keep the card around. I want more land plays to work with Zimone, so I'm going to add Oracle of Moldiah instead. Now, this serves 2 functions for the deck. Extra land plays for Zimone's landfall trigger, and it lets us get lands off the top of the deck, giving us kind of a pseudo surveil effect to get the lands out of the way and dig deeper for things we'd rather flip off the deck with Manifest Dread. Now, all we've talked about so far is great, but what if we draw things we'd rather hit with Manifest Dread? Well, we can add in some cards that let us put things back on top of the deck, but that requires some more cuts. So, Kefnet the Mindful, sorry, you're just not something I really want to use in this deck, so it can go, and so can Dig Through Time. I'm not really comfortable with exiling stuff from my graveyard to make Dig more usable in Commander, and oftentimes I hit more things off of the Dig than I want to have to, put in my hand. So I'm going to get 2 things and then bury whatever's left, and I don't like doing that. So instead, we're going to slot in Brainstorm and Brain Surge. Each of these draw spells will allow us to put cards that we've drawn back on top of the deck, and then we can drop a land and manifest with Zimone on the board, or cast a spell that gives us a Manifest Dread activation. Or we can just slot in something like Scroll Rack. Now, it's not a draw spell per se, but it does allow us to put cards from our hand back on top, similar to Brainstorm. To make room for it, though, we're going to have to axe another spell. And this one I don't particularly care about, and that is Biomass Mutation. The deck already has rather large monsters in it, and I don't like finishers that don't guarantee the actual finish. Biomass Mutation doesn't offer trample, doesn't offer flying, or any other form of evasion. And on top of that, it isn't great if you're not running a deck dedicated to +1/+1 counters to get the most mileage out of boosting base power and toughness of the creatures. There's a few cards in the Precon that mess with counters, but the deck is not a dedicated +1/+1 counter deck on the whole. Now, one thing to remember with the cards that you put back on top and stack your deck up with is you will lose one of the cards to the graveyard when you do a Manifest Dread, so make sure that one of the ones that you put back is something you don't mind dropping into the graveyard. Now, instead of using these draw and stack effects, we can alternatively use Vanifar Evolved Enigma from the Karlov Manor set, which serves 2 purposes in the deck. If you draw something you'd rather have on the board as a face-down 2/2, Vanifar can cloak it from your hand directly, and then Zimone can flip them over for the cost of 2 landfall triggers. Vanifar can also just simply make all of our 2/2 morphed, manifested, or cloaked creatures a threat by putting +1/+1 counters on them, and then remember, those counters stick around after you flip them over, buffing up anything that was once a faceless 2/2. However, to fit her in, we're going to take out Scab Ruinator. The only reason this card is any good in this deck is that you can dodge the exile part on it to if you manifest it and then flip it over, but it's an alright card to dump off to a Manifest Dread as well because it is castable from the grave. But like with Dig Through Time, I don't want to have to exile a bunch of cards from my graveyard in order to cast this, which means I really only like it when it's manifested, and that's not a good enough reason for me to keep it around over the Vanifar. Now, lastly, I want to talk about some cards that we can sift around on the top of our deck to get the best permanents on top to be manifested. And to make room for these options, we're going to remove Augur of Autumn and Wilderness Reclamation. Augur is a good card, but it requires Coven to get the most out of it, and I have been hamstrung in games where I just cannot get Coven online. So instead, I stumbled on a card that I have not seen in a very long time, Cream of the Crop. This card is very good in the deck because it allows you to kick a card down to the bottom but then stack another on top, and it will trigger right after Manifesting Dread since a creature enters off of it, and it will dig you 4 cards deeper into your deck every time you get a Manifest Dread trigger. As for Wilderness Reclamation, it's a card that is, in my play group personally, can draw a massive amount of ire from everyone at the table because it's a card that more often than not is used for combo and counter synergies. It's a good card in the deck. It's, you know, you play things down, you give it the mana used untapped to flip over your morphs and whatnot. But for my build, I'm going to go ahead and use the less attention-grabbing Path of Discovery. Like with Cream of the Crop, the Path gives us an interest trigger that will either get you a land off the top or put a counter on a creature that comes in, and then we can decide to either bury that card because it's not something we want to use to get it something better, or we can see it and go, oh, hey, it's a big monster, and put it on top, and then you can get a Manifest Dread to put it into play as a 2/2. So those are my changes for the Jump Scare Precon. What did you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, thank you for watching. Have a great day, and I will see you in the next video.